The smell hit first raw, oak and pine tar, sweat and sawdust so thick you could almost taste it. We're in the spring of 1759, at Chatham Dockyard, a place humming with a peculiar kind of violence, the kind that builds empires one plank at a time. This is where our story begins. Master shipwright Thomas Slade stands before an empty slipway. Tucked under his arm are the rolled plans for an impossible task. The Admiralty wants a new first-rate ship of a line. It needs to carry more guns, sail faster, and outlast anything the French can float. Slade has 6,000 trees to work with, and the weight of an entire nation's expectations pressing down on him. A first-rate ship demands over 100 cannons across 3 massive gun decks. It needs to house a crew of 800 men, with enough storage for months of provisions. Most importantly, it needs the structural integrity to absorb broadsides that would splinter lesser vessels into driftwood. The first challenge: finding the keel. This single piece of elm, the very spine of the ship, had to be nearly 152 feet long. Foresters scoured the whole of southern England, searching for a tree that had been standing since before the Spanish Armada. It took a team of 40 horses to drag the colossal timber through the muddy roads of Kent. Villagers lined the route, reaching out to touch what would become the backbone of the legendary HMS Victory throughout 1760. The frame was built from curved oak ribs called futtocks. Each one was hand-selected for its natural bend, perfectly matching the templates laid out by Slade. Teams of men worked in a practiced, rhythmic dance, hoisting these massive pieces into place. They used a special kind of wood called compass timber wood grown, where a branch meets the trunk to form the knees that locked the deck beams to the hull. These were unjust carpentry choices. They were tactical decisions. Every single joint, every mortise and tenon, every wooden peg or tree nail driven through 3-inch planking had to hold firm. It had to withstand the thunderous roar of 32-pound cannons firing in sequence, and the brutal impact of enemy iron punching through the hull at point-blank range. Of course, a project of this scale doesn't come cheap. The Navy Board originally allocated a staggering sum of over £63,000, enough money to build a small town. He insisted on using copper bolts instead of iron, knowing that iron would corrode in the constant salt spray. He sourced the impossibly tall, straight pines for the masts from Scandinavia, shipped across the North Sea at an eye-watering expense. When these 3 great masts were finally stepped or set in place, they soared 205 feet above the waterline. It would take 90,000 feet of hemp rope just to control the 26 sails. Below decks, the work was claustrophobic and grueling. Caulkers spent their days driving oakum, a mixture of tarred hemp, fibering to every single seam of the hull. They hammered it in with mallets and irons, their shoulders aching after 12-hour shifts in spaces barely 3 feet high. The lower gun deck, designed to mount 30 massive 32-pounder cannons, was a marvel of engineering. The headroom calculations had to be precise down to the inch. If it was too low, the crews couldn't work the guns effectively. Too high, and the ship's center of gravity would be thrown off, making her roll like a drunk in a hammock. Slade was a constant presence on the build site. He walked these confined spaces relentlessly, checking every angle with his plumb lines, arguing with foremen who wanted to cut corners he simply refused to tolerate. By 1764, the construction of Victory had consumed an entire forest's worth of oak. We were talking about the equivalent of 60 acres of mature woodland, with each tree being at least a century old. Her hull planking was 4 layers thick at the waterline, tapering to 2 layers above. Massive strakes of timber, called the lower wales, ran the entire length of the ship. They were bolted through with tons and tons of iron inside. The ship was a labyrinth of decks taking shape. Deep in the hold was the orlop deck, a dark, foreboding place where surgeons would one day amputate limbs by flickering candlelight. Above that were the gun decks, with their precisely calculated spacing for the cannons, and at the very top were the upper works, where the officers' cabins offered the fleet's only small semblance of privacy. Launch day finally arrived on May 7, 1765. The weather was typically English, grey skies, a cold drizzle, but that didn't stop a massive crowd from packing Chatham's waterfront. There she sat, the great ship resting in her cradle, awaiting the moment that would either prove Slade's mathematics correct, or create Britain's most expensive pile of firewood. The signal was given, and at noon, the triggers holding her in place were knocked away. She began to slide down the tallow-greased ways, gathering speed with a terrifying momentum. Her bow sliced into the Medway River with a force that sent a huge wave surging across the mudflats. For 5 long, heart-stopping seconds, she seemed to hesitate, as if settling into her new element. And then, She floated perfectly trimmed, listing neither to port nor to starboard. A masterpiece of balance and design, but floating was unto the same as fighting. The massive hull was complete, but Victory was still just a hollow shell. The real work of turning her into a warship was just beginning over the next 13 months. An army of riggers swarmed her masts. They bent on the yards, the horizontal spars that hold the sails, and ran miles of rigging through hundreds of wooden blocks. Then came the gunners. They manhandled 40 tons of iron artillery, up steep ramps and through the ship's gun. Each weapon was carefully positioned on its carriage, and the crews began the long process of training, learning how to fire 3 rounds per minute in the deafening chaos of battle. Meanwhile, sailmakers stitched together acres of canvas. Coopers built thousands of barrels for fresh water, salt pork, and the daily grog ration that was essential for keeping 800 men from mutiny. Slowly, impossibly, this wooden skeleton was transformed. She became a living, breathing warship. The final cost was far more than budgeted. The construction took much longer than promised, and it stretched every resource the Chatham dockyard could possibly muster. But when HMS Victory finally dropped down the Thames and headed for the Channel in 1778, full 13 years after her launch, she was everything Thomas Slade had envisioned. She was a floating fortress of oak and iron, a symbol of industrial might and naval power. She was a ship built to command the seas and to decide the very fate of nations. On October 21, 1805, the wind blew from the northwest off Cape Trafalgar. It was a good day for a battle. On the quarterdeck of HMS Victory, Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson watched 33 French and Spanish ships form a ragged line on the horizon. A smile touched the half of his face that still worked properly. He studied the enemy's combined fleet through his one good eye, a piercing blue gaze taking in every detail. Around him, Victory's crew moved with a practiced, grim efficiency. These men knew their wooden world was about to become a slaughterhouse. This wasn't just another naval engagement. It was the culmination of Nelson's audacious, almost insane, tactical genius. 3 weeks earlier, over dinner, he had explained his plan to his captains. They would forget the traditional, formal rules of engagement, the stately parallel lines where fleets hammered each other for hours. Instead, the British fleet would split into 2 columns and drive straight into the enemy's formation, perpendicular, like arrows piercing flesh. It was a plan that violated every tactical convention. It would deliberately expose his lead ships to devastating raking fire as they slowly approached, unable to fire back. The entire strategy depended on one thing: the belief that British gunnery was so superior, so rapid and deadly, that his ships could survive the initial butchery and then unleash hell at point-blank range. His captains, to a man, had loved it. Now, as Nelson watched the combined fleet wallowing in the light breeze, he was about to discover if his genius was just a different name for madness. Victory led the northern column, a spearhead aimed at the heart of the enemy. Nelson's eye was fixed on a true Leviathan, the Spanish Santísima Trinidad, a colossal fordica ship carrying 140 guns that dwarfed even his own flagship. Beside him stood Captain Thomas Hardy, the man responsible for Victory's daily operations and a trusted friend. Hardy, ever practical, suggested that perhaps the Admiral might want to transfer his flag to a faster, smaller frigate somewhere, less likely to attract every single enemy cannon within range. Nelson's response was swift and characteristic of the man. He ordered signal flags to be prepared. At 11:40, a message climbed Victory's mast, fluttering in the breeze for the entire fleet to see. England expects that every man will do his duty. The effect was electric. 800 throats on Victory alone roared their approval. Across the fleet, 27 ships of the line acknowledged the signal. The die was cast. The approach took 2 agonizingly long hours. Victory crept forward at maybe 3 knots, a snail's pace. Her bow pointed directly at the enemy line, presenting her vulnerable, undefended stern to concentrated broadsides from the French ships. But Nelson, a man defined by his courage, walked the quarterdeck in his full admiral's coat. It was bright with decorations, glittering stars that marked him as a target as clearly as a battle flag. He refused to go below deck, refused to take off the coat that made him visible from a mile away. Captain Hardy tried again to persuade him, to urge him to take some precaution. Nelson simply gestured with his one remaining arm. He'd lost the right at the Battle of Tenerife, dismissive wave. It was too late to change coats now. His place was here, with his men. The first shots finally came at high noon. French 36-pounders had found their range. A round shot screamed across Victory's deck, missing Nelson by a mere 10 feet, but had found another target. It cut his secretary, John Scott, nearly in half. Blood sprayed across the Admiral's boots. He glanced down, then looked at Hardy and said simply, "This is too warm work to last long," and continued his walk. A moment later, a single cannonball obliterated a group of 8 Royal Marines standing nearby. The quarterdeck became a chaotic hell of flying splinters, dust, and the screams of the wounded. But through it all, Victory's guns remained silent. Nelson had given a strict order: do not fire until they were so close that every single shot would be catastrophic. At 20 minutes past 12, Victory's bow finally pierced the enemy line. She slid across the stern of the French flagship Bucentaur at a distance of perhaps 20 yards. The moment had come. Nelson's order was immediate: full broadside. 50 cannons on one side of Victory fired simultaneously, a deafening, earth-shattering roar. The volley smashed into Bucentaur's unprotected stern, the cannonballs raking the entire length of the ship. They turned her gun decks into abattoirs, where heavy iron balls bounced through densely packed men like bowling balls through wet clay. Bucentaur's mizzenmast crashed down, a crippling blow. Victory swept past, already engaging her next opponent, the Redoubtable, on her port side. The French 74-gun ship closed in, and the two vessels ground together, locked in a brutal, personal embrace. The fight was no longer at a distance. It was hand-to-hand, ship-to-ship. From the fighting tops high in the Redoubtable's masts, French marksmen with muskets began picking off the officers on Victory's exposed quarterdeck. At 1:15 in the afternoon, Nelson was pacing near Hardy when the fatal shot came. A musket ball, fired from above, struck him in the left shoulder. It tore through his body, passed through his spine, and lodged near his right shoulder blade. He fell to his knees, then collapsed onto his side on the blood-soaked deck. Hardy rushed to his side. Nelson's voice, though weak, was calm and matter-of-fact. "They have done for me at last, Hardy. My backbone is shot through." They carried him below. Down 3 levels to the orlop deck, a dark wooden hill, where the ship's surgeon, William Beatty, worked by flickering lantern light among the rows of screaming, wounded men. Nelson knew instantly that his wound was mortal. The paralysis spreading through his body, the searing pain in his chest, and a peculiar cold creeping up from his legs told him everything. But even as he lay dying, he was still the Admiral. He gave orders: send Hardy back to the quarterdeck. The battle wasn't won yet. For 3 hours, he lay on a simple midshipman's cot. Above him, the rhythmic thunder of Victory's guns continued their deadly work. Above him, men died by the dozen, and the Royal Navy systematically dismantled the combined might of the French and Spanish fleets. Captain Hardy came down twice to give his dying commander a report. The first time at 2:30, he reported that 14 enemy ships had been captured. Nelson, his voice now a whisper, gave instructions for anchoring the fleet after the battle. He knew a storm was coming. Hardy came down again at 3:30. The news was even better. 20 prizes now, perhaps more. The enemy fleet was shattered beyond repair. Nelson's hand gripped Hardy's. "Kiss me, Hardy," he whispered. The stoic captain bent down and kissed his admiral's forehead. Nelson's voice faded to barely audible. "Thank God I have done my duty." At 4:30 in the afternoon, with Victory's guns finally silent and the enemy defeated, Horatio Nelson stopped breathing. The greatest naval battle in the age of sail was won. The price was one dead admiral, but the prize was immeasurable. Britain would rule the waves, unchallenged, for the next 100 years. Nelson's sacrifice ensured a century of British naval supremacy, changing the course of history forever. After the Battle of Trafalgar, the first problem the Royal Navy faced was a grim one: what to do with the body of a dead hero. Lord Nelson had to be returned to England for a state funeral, but the voyage home would take weeks. The fleet surgeon, William Beatty, came up with a practical, if gruesome, solution. He had Nelson's body stripped and placed inside a large water barrel, a Liga cask, which was then filled with brandy to preserve it. His ship, HMS Victory, battered and leaking, limped north with makeshift masts. The funeral in January 1806 was a massive event, turning London into a sea of black cloth and public grief. But for Victory, there was no rest. She was a tool of war, and the war wasn't over. For the next 7 years, she served as a flagship in the Baltic and the English Channel. Her decks, once slick with the carnage of Trafalgar, now echoed with the endless drills of new gun crews. The carpenters patched her battle scars with whatever timber they could find, but time and the sea were relentless. The great oak timbers that had withstood French cannonballs began to rot in the dampness between decks. In that era, ships didn't get a dignified retirement. They sailed until they fell apart, sank in a storm, or were deliberately broken up. By 1812, Victory was showing her age. 47 years at sea had weakened her frames and sprung her planks. The Admiralty deemed her unfit for active duty and relegated her to the role of a harbour ship in Portsmouth, basically a floating office and barracks. It was a common, unglamorous end for a once mighty warship. Most of her contemporaries ended up as prison hulks or were dismantled for their valuable timber. What saved Victory from this fate was sentiment, but it took another century for that sentiment to turn into action. Throughout the 1800s, she served various mundane roles. Her guns were removed, her masts were cut down, and her sleek, powerful hull was cluttered with ugly deckhouses and workshops. The place where Nelson fell became a quiet tourist spot for those with the right connections. But to the Admiralty, she was just a useful old hulk, nothing sacred. The real turning point came in 1922. A survey revealed a shocking truth. Victory was literally sinking at her moorings. A century of neglect had left her a waterlogged wreck, held together more by habit than by her own strength. The public was horrified. The Society for Nautical Research launched a massive public appeal, Save Nelson's flagship. The response was overwhelming. King George V made a personal contribution. School children sent their pennies. Retired sailors donated parts of their pensions. The nation rallied to save its most famous ship. Within 2 years, enough money had been raised to begin the most ambitious ship restoration project ever attempted. In 1928, Victory was moved into the world's oldest surviving dry dock at Portsmouth, where she rests to this day. She's not floating, but cradled in a massive structure of concrete and steel. This support is crucial, preventing her ancient oak hull from collapsing under its own weight. The restoration work is a story in itself, and it has never stopped. Teams of skilled shipwrights use 18th century tools and techniques to replace rotted timbers, carefully matching the grain and curve of the original design. This raises a fascinating philosophical question, the ship of Theseus paradox. If you replace every part of a ship, is it still the same ship? In Victory's case, the answer is a resounding yes. As long as the form is preserved and the intent remains true, she is still Victory. Today, it's estimated that less than 20% of her original timber remains. Walking her decks is like stepping into another world. The lower gun deck still carries the faint, evocative smell of tar and old wood. When you stand on the quarterdeck, on the spot marked by a brass plaque, where Nelson fell, you are standing on original planking. Tour guides might politely avoid the subject, but that dark stain is almost certainly a trace of his blood, soaked too deep into the wood to ever be removed. The great cabin at the stern, where Nelson and his captains planned their decisive battle, has been meticulously restored to how it looked in 1805. The furniture is reproduction, but it's placed exactly where historical records say it was. Every year, around 350,000 people visit, making Victory the most visited historic warship in the world. And here's a strange fact. She is still a commissioned vessel in the Royal Navy. She flies the White Ensign, and her commanding officer is a serving captain. This creates a bizarre legal and administrative situation. Victory is simultaneously a museum, a national memorial, a massive construction project, and an active naval command. The craftsmen who painstakingly replace her frames report through the same chain of command that once unleashed broadsides against Napoleon's fleet. The ultimate irony is that HMS Victory has now existed far longer as a memorial than she ever did as a weapon of war. Her glorious fighting career, culminating at Trafalgar in 1805, was effectively over by 1812, just 7 years of fame. Yet she has been preserved for over a century, a living piece of history visited by millions. Nelson achieved his immortality through a hero's death. His ship, by a twist of fate, found hers, not by sinking in a blaze of glory, but by simply refusing to disappear. She became too important to let rot, transforming from an instrument of war into a witness to history. She no longer floats on the ocean, but in our collective memory and national story, and that has proven to be more permanent than any sea. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this journey into the past, please consider liking and subscribing for more stories like this.